A lock of hair. That's all it took. Not a skull pulled from limestone. Not ancient footprints pressed into volcanic ash. Not an artifact dug up after a century of careful excavation.
A lock of hair that had been sitting in a box in a British museum since 1923, cut from an Aboriginal Australian man whose name was never properly recorded. Just a donor, just a sample, just a formality in a colonial-era anthropological collection that nobody thought much about for the next 8 decades.
When a team of Danish geneticists finally sequenced it, they got a number back. I'm going to give you that number right now, before anything else, because everything that follows only makes sense if you hold it in your head from the start. The number was 75,000. 75,000 years.
That is how far back the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians branched off from every other human lineage on the planet.
Not 10,000 years.
Not 20,000.
75,000 years of continuous, unbroken human presence. A living thread of culture, language, and memory stretching from the present moment back to a time when our species was still figuring out whether it would survive at all. Scientists weren't just surprised. Some of them had to go back and redo their calculations. But to understand why the number hit so hard, you have to understand what the dominant story was before.
For most of the 20th century, the scientific consensus on human migration looked something like this. Modern Homo sapiens evolved in Africa around 200,000 years ago, spent roughly 140,000 years there, and then began spreading outward in a single major wave of migration somewhere around 60,000 years ago.
That wave moved east through the Middle East, splintered into branches, and eventually populated all Asia and the Americas. Linear, one departure wave. Under that model, Aboriginal Australians arrived in Australia roughly 50,000 years ago. Impressive, yes, and ancient by any reasonable standard, but still part of that same wave migration plan. Later than Africa, same as everywhere else, just heading in a different direction. That was the story. It had been the story for decades. It was in the textbooks. And then the hair cycle. The main people of the 2011 study was Leslie Weatherspoon, a Danish geneticist at the University of Copenhagen. Someone who had already built a reputation for extracting ancient DNA from hair, bones, and peripheral cells that other scientists assumed were too degraded to provide. When the 1923 sample came from his lab, it wasn't supposed to be a world-changing discovery. It was supposed to be a technical demonstration that Aboriginal Australian DNA could be recovered and sequenced again. What Willer's Lab's team wrote instead was that the Aboriginal Australian genetic lineage had diverged from other major populations not 50,000 years ago, but somewhere between 62,000 and 75,000 years ago. Depending on the model, possibly more. And this wasn't a replica. This wasn't the kind of statistical errors way over. This was a separate
Departure from Africa, a branch of modern humans who left the continent before the main migration, moved through South Asia along what was then a coastline that no longer exists, and crossed into what is now Australia at a time when sea levels were low enough that the journey was possible, though never easy.
They walked and paddled, crossed over water gaps, and at least
to justify dispossession of land, forced removal of children from families, systematic destruction of cultural and ceremonial practices, policies of assimilation designed to erase a culture that Europeans assumed was on its way out anyway. An entire apparatus of violence built on a premise that genetics has now comprehensively dismantled. The data does not say Aboriginal Australians are biologically superior. That framing misses the point entirely. What the data says is that Aboriginal Australians represent the longest uninterrupted human success story on the planet.
While other populations collapsed, merged, were displaced, went extinct, or simply moved on, one population stayed in one place and adapted through every ice age, every prolonged drought, every ecological disruption the Australian continent produced across 65,000 years.
They developed one of the most complex astronomical knowledge systems in the ancient world. Aboriginal Australians were tracking planetary motion, stellar cycles, and seasonal navigation, using knowledge encoded in story and song long before any other culture built its first observatory. They developed pharmacological knowledge of native plants that modern researchers are still cataloging. They managed landscapes through controlled burning on a continental scale, a practice that prevented the catastrophic wildfires that have become a recurring crisis since European settlers stopped it. That is not primitiveness. That is mastery of the highest order. And the Toba eruption ties into this in a way that still isn't fully understood. Around 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano on the island of Sumatra, the same island that holds Lake Toba today, produced the largest volcanic eruption in the last 2 million years. The ash cloud covered most of South Asia. Global temperatures dropped. Some researchers estimate the total human population after Toba collapsed to fewer than 10,000 individuals worldwide. Humanity came within a narrow margin of vanishing entirely. The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians were apparently already in motion by then, moving along the southern coast of Asia, following the Australia shortly after that, near extinction, crossing open ocean in some of the oldest confirmed seafaring in human history. And they built a civilization in the shadow of a planetary catastrophe. They didn't just survive, they navigated past and across the sea and kept going. So when scientists talk about the oldest race on Earth, a phrase that sounds like a headline and not much more, what they are actually describing is the lineage that predates every major civilization, every major religion, every written language, every empire that has ever risen and fallen by margins so large they almost stop making sense as numbers. The Roman Empire lasted about 3,000 years. The Egyptian pharaohs ruled for about 3,000. The oldest Aboriginal Australian cultural traditions are 20 times older than the oldest Egyptian ones. The oldest Aboriginal Australian city sites were already ancient before agriculture had been invented anywhere on Earth. A lock of hair in a museum drawer asked us to reckon with that. The number 75,000 is not just a number of genetics. It is a correction, a recalibration of what we mean when we say the word ancient.
It is an invitation to look at a living culture, not a museum exhibit, not a room, but a culture speaking languages and knowledge that have been continuously transmitted for longer than modern human civilization has existed in any form, and actually see what we're looking at.
If something in this shifted how you feel, even worried, tell me in the comments what surprised you most. Because there is a follow-up coming on what Aboriginal Australian oral traditions already knew about Australia's underwater geography, knowledge that became scientifically verifiable when we got satellite bathymetric mapping, stories about coastlines that vanished 12,000 years ago, preserved with enough accuracy to locate specific archaeological sites. That one is something else entirely. You don't want to miss it.